right here at FM 88, Voice of Thailand, Radio Thailand. FM 88, your APAC Business News channel and more. Thailand's administration understands that even with COVID-19 under control, the world has entered into a new normal and has adopted appropriate measures and practices to accommodate this reality. Continuing use of its digital applications and public health protocols, the government will usher Thailand's citizens through the transition into this new era, empowering all to live alongside COVID-19. This wraps up the national news. International news is next. FM 88, the Voice of Thailand. Follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and our website. And that was the business news. Up next, international news. International news. Welcome back. You're listening to Voice of Thailand's morning news hour. We begin the international news with a report from the European Mediterranean Seismological Center on Saturday, reporting that an earthquake measuring at a magnitude of 6 struck New Britain region in Papua New Guinea. The quake was at a depth of 134 kilometers. We will bring you further details once we have more information. And from there we move to Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Former Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa on Friday returned to the country from Thailand nearly 2 months after he fled the country following a massive uprising against his government over the island nation's worst ever economic crisis. Rajapaksa, 73, fled the country on July the 13th after months-long mass public demonstrations demanding his immediate resignation on July the 9th. Which gained momentum after protesters stormed the president's house in Colombo and several other buildings in the capital. The former president returned to Sri Lanka on a Singapore Airlines flight. He traveled from Thailand to Singapore to take the flight, as there are no direct flights between Bangkok and Colombo. And moving on to the situation in Pakistan, planes carrying fresh supplies are surging across a humanitarian air bridge to flood-ravaged Pakistan as death toll surged past 1,200 according to official numbers on Friday, with families and children at special risk of disease and homelessness. The 9th flight from the United Arab Emirates and the first from Uzbekistan was the latest to land in Islamabad overnight as a military-backed rescue operation elsewhere in the country reached more than 3 million people affected by the disaster. 2 more planes from UAE and Qatar will arrive in Pakistan later in the day. And a Turkish train carrying relief goods for flood victims was on its way to the impoverished nation, according to the Foreign Ministry. Multiple officials have blamed the unusual monsoon and flooding on climate change, including UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who earlier this week called on the world to stop sleepwalking through the deadly crisis. Guterres will visit Pakistan on September 9th to tour the flood-hit areas and to meet with officials. According to the spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry of Pakistan, on Thursday stated that the crisis has lent credibility to climate change warnings from scientists. This is not a conspiracy, he stated. This is a reality, and we need to be mindful. The UN Refugee Agency on Friday stated that while the response to a funding appeal earlier this week was very encouraging, more needed to be done. The UNHCR spokesperson Matthew Saltmarsh said they were quickly releasing tents as well as blankets, plastic sheets, buckets, and other household items for flood victims, stating the scale of the devastation that people are facing is unimaginable. The plane brought additional food items, medicine, and tents. According to Pakistani Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif, had planned to travel to UAE on Saturday, but he postponed his trip to visit the flood-hit areas at home. A Turkish delegation led by Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu met with Sharif to convey condolences over the disaster. So far, Pakistan has received aid from China, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Uzbekistan, UAE, and some other countries. This week, the United States also announced a $30 million worth of aid for the flood victims. According to initial government estimates, the devastation has caused $10 billion in damage. Since 1959, Pakistan has emitted less than 1% of the world's heat-trapping carbon dioxide, compared to 21.5% by the US and 16.4% by China, according to scientists and experts. Pakistani officials and experts say there's been a 400% increase in average rainfall in some parts of Pakistan, which has led to extreme flooding. Earlier this week, the United Nations and Pakistan jointly issued an appeal for $160 million in emergency funding to help the 3.3 million people affected by the floods, which have damaged over 1 billion homes. And from there, we move to solar power in India. A recent collaboration between the United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF, and the Japanese government has brought relief to residents in remote villages by setting up solar-powered refrigeration units to store vaccines. At the initial break of COVID-19, batches of vaccines had to be thrown out as the shots were spoiled, as there was no electricity and therefore no refrigeration facilities. So far, 27 such units have been established as part of the project, costing around $9.3 million each. The units do not require a battery to store energy and can run efficiently in rural areas where sunshine is abundant and are easy to install and maintain. India's universal immunization program is one of the largest public health interventions in the world, aiming to inoculate around 26 million infants and 29 million pregnant women annually. The vaccines administered under the program are all given free of cost. Although India is the largest supplier of vaccines globally, producing over 60% of the world's vaccine, the rate of wastage is high. Last year, for instance, over 6 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine went to waste in the country. A major reason for the wastage was a lack of proper refrigeration facilities at healthcare centers, rendering these shots useless within a short span of time. In Rajasthan, blistering heat waves are a norm, with large swaths of the state recording high temperatures of over 50 degrees Celsius, particularly in summer months. Long and frequent power outages in part of the state add to the problem by making it more difficult to maintain cold temperatures for vaccine storage. Healthcare personnel walked for kilometers at a stretch in extreme temperatures throughout the day and then raced back to Rajasthan city to bring back the leftover vaccines to ensure there was no spoilage. With the installation of the solar-powered refrigeration systems, not only has the spoilage and wastage of the vaccines gone down, but people have been coming on their own to get vaccinated. UNICEF says that it now has plans to expand the program to provide solar power-based refrigeration units to public health care centers in other parts of the country. And moving on to Hawaii. Last bits of ash and greenhouse gases from Hawaii's only remaining coal-fired power plant slipped into the environment this week when the state's dirtiest source of electric burned its final pieces of fuel. The last coal shipment arrived in the island at the end of July, and the AES Corporation coal plant closed Thursday after 30 years in operation. This facility produced up to 1/5 of the electricity on Oahu, the most populous island in the state of nearly 1.5 million people. According to the Hawaiian governor, it's really about reducing greenhouse gases, and the coal facility is one of the largest emitters. Taking it offline means that we'll stop the 1.5 million metric tons of greenhouse gases that are emitted annually. Like other Pacific islands, the Hawaiian chain has suffered the cascading impacts of climate change. The state is experiencing the destruction of coral reefs from bleaching associated with increased ocean temperatures, rapid sea level rise, a more intense storm, and droughts that are increasing, including statewide wildfire risk. In 2020, Hawaiian legislature passed a law banning the use of coal for energy production at the start of 2023. Hawaii has mandated a transition to 100% renewable energy by 2045 and was the first state to set such a goal. But critics say that while ending the state's dirtiest source of energy is ultimately a good move, doing so now is not. Renewable costs means to replace coal energy and are not yet online because of permitting delays, contract issues, and pandemic-related supply chain problems. So the state will instead burn more costly oil that is usually slightly less polluting than coal. And that wraps up the international news. Do stay tuned for the international business news coming up right after this. For advertising, please write to Voice of Thailand 2022@gmail.com or call 080-282-6646.
Throughout history, the Royal Institution has played an integral part in bettering the communities of the Kingdom South and inspiring it to peace and harmony. The office of the Chaipatana Foundation reflected on the graceful benevolence bestowed by the kingdom's royal family upon the southernmost region in an article published for the international community. The piece began by stating that it was in 1964 that Their Majesties King Bhumibol Adulyadej the Great and Queen Surrogate, the Queen Mother, presided over the Maulid Nabi celebration held by the Central Islamic Council of Thailand, pointing out that the event underlined how the monarchy and Muslims in Thailand had developed a lasting bond throughout history. While noting that, by tradition and constitutional requirement, the King of Thailand must be a Buddhist, the piece clarifies the tradition also calls for the monarch to be the royal patron of all faiths, and successive Thai kings have carried on this important practice. The article stressed that Islam has been welcomed and supported by the royal court since its arrival in the 9th century, adding that many Muslims were appointed to senior posts in the royal court during the Ayutthaya kingdom, and Muslim communities were granted land for settlement. It was also noted that the position of Jila Rajamundry was also established to oversee the affairs of Muslims in the kingdom. The Foundation's article explained that after King Bhumibol Adulyadej the Great received an Arabic copy of the Holy Quran in 1962, His Majesty had the magnificent thought that the Thai translation of the Holy Quran could aid Thai Muslims to develop a deeper understanding of Islamic teachings. The Thai Quran with the royal cipher of King Bhumibol Adulyadej the Great on its green cover was published by the Religious Affairs Department in 1968. Concluding the archive, the Foundation pointed out His Majesty the King continues to promote amongst Thai Muslims a deeper connection to their faith, as the Royal Institution maintains the belief that if religions are empathetic and supportive of each other, then peace and stability of the nation will prevail.
FM 88, the Voice of Thailand. Follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and our website. That was the international news. Up next, international business news. International business news. Welcome back. You're listening to Voice of Thailand's Morning News Hour. We begin the international business news with the G7 price cap plan for Russian oil. The group of seven, generally representing a group of the most industrialized countries, said they plan to implement a price cap for global purchases of Russian oil, a measure the U.S. hopes will ease energy market pressures and slash Moscow's overall revenues. The ministers said they plan to implement a price cap in line with the timing of the European Union sanctions on Russian oil, set to kick in on December 5th. The statement, which notes that all EU nations will have to sign off on any sanction changes, but did not provide a dollar range from the eventual price cap. The G7, which is part of the broader effort to punish Russia for its military invasion of Ukraine, would allow buyers of Russian oil under a capped price to continue getting crucial services, such as financing and insurance for tankers. The plan is aimed at encouraging Russia to continue to produce and export oil, according to senior U.S. officials, adding that the price cap will be set above Russia's production cost. The coalition plans to set a specific price point for Russian crude and 2 different ones for refined products. Prices slightly pared gains on the newly news release. The G7 was nearing a deal as traders grapple with the probabilities of such a regime being imposed and any impact that might have. To implement the cap, diplomats will have to convince the European Union member nations to amend its 6th round of sanctions on Russia over the invasion of Ukraine, and that may still prove to be tough. The package, which prohibits the purchase of Russian oil starting December 5th, includes a ban on the use by third countries of the bloc companies for oil-related insurance and financial services. The proposal would strengthen the EU sanctions package, the bloc's economy Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni said in a statement, adding that European Commission will help work towards a unanimous deal among the 27 nations to implement the measure. But it remains unclear how effective a price cap regime would be, particularly since some of Russia's biggest buyers haven't agreed to join. India is reluctant to firmly join in a price cap scheme since the industry worries it would lose out on other buyers on the chance of buying discounted Russian crude. Senior U.S. Treasury officials said the countries buying outside the price cap regime will need to find alternative ways to insure and finance those purchases, which will be more expensive and risky, which will lead to them to see lower prices from that of Moscow. And from there, we take a look at the global bond market. Under pressure from central bankers determined to quash inflation even at the cost of a recession, global bonds slumped into their first bear market in a generation. The Bloomberg Global Aggregate Total Return Index of government and investment-grade corporate bonds has fallen more than 20% below its 2021 peak, the biggest drawdown since its 1990 inception. Officials from the U.S. to Europe have hammered home the importance of tighter monetary policy in recent days, building on the strong hawkish message from the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, at the recent Jackson Hole Symposium. Soaring inflation and steep interest rate hikes applied by policymakers in response have brought to an end a 4-decade bull market in bonds that has created a particularly difficult environment for investors this year, with bonds and stocks sinking in tandem. The very high inflation of the world now faces means that central banks must be prepared to deploy the sort of extreme stimulus that helps some treasury yields below 1%. The simultaneous swoon for fixed income and equity assets are undermining a mainstay of investing strategies over the past 40 years or more. Bloomberg's bond yield is down 16% in 2022, while MSCI Inc.'s index of global stocks has seen a larger decline. That has pushed a U.S. measure of the classic 60-40 portfolio, where investments are split by those proportions between stocks and bonds, down 15% so far this year, on track for its worst annual loss since 2008. In many ways, the economic and policy realities are now facing investors, harkening back to the 1960s bear market for bonds, which began in the second half of that decade, when a period of low inflation and unemployment came to a sudden end. As inflation accelerated through the 1970s, benchmark treasury yields surged. They would later hit almost 16% in 1981, after then-Fed Chair Paul Volcker had raised rates to 20% to tame price pressures. Other central bankers at Jackson Hole, from Europe to South Korea and New Zealand, also indicated that rates will continue to rise at a pace. Still, fixed income investors are showing plenty of demand for government bonds as yields rise, aided by lingering expectations that policymakers will need to reverse course should economic slowdowns help cool inflation. In the U.S., option markets are still pricing in more than 125 basis point rate cut next year. Stated one investment analyst, this would not be characterized as a new secular bond bear market, but more of a necessary correction from a period of unsustainably ultra-low yields, rather. The expectations are that yields will remain low by long-term historical standards, and 2022 is likely to represent the peak in 10-year bond yields in the current cycle. Meanwhile, in South Korea's industrial lending hit its second highest growth in the second quarter on soaring commodity prices, according to reports from the central bank on Friday. That's owed by all industries to deposit-taking financial institutions, amounted to $1.26 trillion at the end of June, up $68.4 trillion won, or $50.3 billion from 3 months earlier, according to the Bank of Korea. It marked the second highest quarterly increase as surging energy costs led industrial companies to borrow money. Lending to service industries jumped by $35.4 billion during April to June quarter. Real estate developer invested in commercial properties with borrowed money, while lending to the wholesale and retail sector picked up amid the resurgence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lending to the manufacturing industry gained $8 billion from 3 months earlier to $323 billion at the end of June. The industrial lending for the operating fund soared by $32 billion during the second quarter, and the lending for facilities funds grew by 24% to $17 billion. And from there we move to Tencent. According to a Financial Times report, Tencent Holdings Limited has set a soft target of divesting about 100 billion yuan, or $14.5 billion of its $88 billion listed equity portfolio this year as it shifts strategy. Food delivery service Meituan is among the assets that are in the pipeline for divestment. Reduction in stake could ease pressure from anti-monopoly regulators. Beijing, since late 2020, has worked to curb the influence of tech industry leaders from Tencent to Alibaba Group Holding. The two companies exert enormous sway over the Chinese internet economy through part ownership of hundreds of startups and publicly traded firms. The WeChat operator last year began disclosing plans to sell shares in investees such as e-commerce giant JD.com Incorporated and Southeast Asia Sea Limited. That in turn spurred speculation that it would soon consider pairing stakes in other firms such as Meituan and Pinduoduo. Earlier this month, Tencent executives said a report that the company planned to sell all or most of its $24 billion stake in Meituan was not correct. The Shenzhen-based company's biggest investments include Sea Limited, Kuaishou Technology, and Bilibili Incorporated. The American depository receipts of Pinduoduo dropped by as much as 1.8% in extended trading in New York, while Sea slipped as much as 1.3%. The disinvestment drive has begun, though there are still discussions on which stakes in non-core businesses would be paired and the price. Sales would depend on market conditions and internal targets. And that wraps up the International Business News segment, the Morning News Hour. Do stay tuned for the APAC VIP interview with the president of the Gems and Jewelry Institute. And that concludes the International Business News. For advertisements, please write to Voice of Thailand 2022 at gmail.com or call 080 282 6646.